Welcome once again, ladies and gentlemen, to the Adventures in Historyland YouTube channel and the continuing saga that is 1812 with Josh and Jimmy. Man, I really wish I had learned to say that in Russian by now and impress people. But I haven't. All I can say, I think, is the Battle of Borodino in Russian, and Jimmy will make fun of me for trying to say it. But Borodinskaya bitva.
Borodinskaya bitva, yeah, or Borodinskaya sражение as well. I mean,
okay.
Not bad.
Спасибо. Yay, we did that.
Hurrah!
Hurrah! And now, as you might have guessed, we are going to be talking about said Borodinskaya bitva in a very special way. This is a very special episode. We're really excited about it because we're bringing you not one, but 14 Napoleonic enthusiasts and historians, reading 15,000 words from 5 French and 8 Russian accounts to commemorate 208th anniversary of the Borodinskaya bitva, which involved approximately 250,000 men, of whom 70,000 became casualties within 12 hours, and also included the colossal battery of 1,200 guns, if you count every artillery piece on the field.
This video, which we're calling Voices of Borodino, is inspired by our good friend Zach White, who is a previous who has made a previous appearance on the Historyland channel. And for the 205th anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo, he put together, I think it was around 40 accounts of the Battle of Waterloo, read by various Napoleonic historians and enthusiasts on his podcast, The Napoleonicist. So we're doing something slightly less ambitious by only having 14 people, but we hope that it will be an interesting video and that it will give perspectives on both sides of the battle.
And without further ado, we present Voices from Borodino.
The first account is from the French colonel Jean-Jacques Germain Pelet-Clozeau, later general, who in 1812 is serving on the staff of General Marchand. The account is read by Jacqueline Reiter, who has also been a guest on the channel.
Hello, my name is Jacqueline Reiter. I'm a historian of British Napoleonic military and political history. I'm the author of the book The Late Lord, The Life of John Pitt, 2nd Earl of Chatham, about the elder brother of Pitt the Younger, most infamous for bungling the Walcheren expedition. I am going to read to you a passage written by Jean-Jacques Germain Pelet-Clozeau. He was a colonel serving on the staff of General Marchand at the Battle of Borodino. At dawn on the 7th, the imperial proclamation was read to the French ranks, which inflamed those noble hearts, and which will inspire noble hearts from all countries and all ages. "Soldiers," the emperor said, "here is the battle which you have so desired. From now the victory depends on you. It is necessary to us. It will bring us an abundance of good winter quarters and a swift return to our country. Behave as at Austerlitz, Friedland, Vitebsk, Smolensk, and let the latest posterity recount with pride your deeds this day. Let them say of you, he was at the great battle beneath the walls of Moscow." The soldiers replied with joyful cries. They told Napoleon, "Be assured, today we have all sworn to win, and we will win." The emperor spent the night in his bivouac at Valuevo. His tents were surrounded by the bright fires of part of the army in order to attract the attention of the Russians. He rode out at 2 o'clock, during the pitch darkness and along very difficult roads, to the redoubt, taken on the 6th. he waited the dawn of day among his generals, giving them their final orders. With the rising of a bright sun, which was greeted with memories of Austerlitz, all the troops took up their battle positions. Around 6 o'clock, the fixed batteries opened fire on the right flank. They were closely followed by the central battery. Soon, in the direction of the left flank, the artillery of the 4 Corps was heard. The guns were firing along the whole line. The right flank of the French army, made up of Comte and Desaix's divisions, to attack the Redans to the south of Sebenovsko, the enemy's left flank. In order to achieve this goal, it was compelled to cross through half a mile of extremely difficult terrain. It passed along the edge of the woods, preceded by its artillery. At halfway, it encountered a ravine occupied by Russian Jaegers supported by Borodino's first line. Under terrible artillery fire, Comte attacked the enemy fortifications. Desaix followed after him. These brave divisions crossed through the ravine and fell on the first enemy line. They pursued them with bayonets and attacked the second line. This latter was not able to stand up to their efforts. The Redans were taken by the first troops, which in their turn were driven out. Upon receiving support, they again occupied the fortifications. Our division suffered terrible losses from the very beginning of the battle. In a quarter of an hour, Davout, Comte, Desaix, Dupelin were all wounded, as was Rapp, who had come to replace Comte. The wounds of the commanders did not calm the fervour of the soldiers, but they upset the direction of movement. The Polish corps, who were to support the right flank by taking Utitsa, advanced less than a mile and a half. It proceeded very slowly, made frequent halts, and appeared in front of the enemy very late. Instead of attacking swiftly, it was tied down by cannon fire. It gave time to Tushkov, who left Konovnitsin's division behind to send Stroganov's division into the village. These delays adversely affected the progress of the right flank. Utitsa, lying a mile away from Comte, was later taken without much resistance from the Russians. Marshal Ney, commanding the centre of the line, between 1 and 4 Corps, received the order to attack at around 7 o'clock. His orders were to proceed to the north of Sebenovsko, where the ravine branches out, and to the woods, which were situated on the lower part. But as soon as the head of 3 Corps descended into the ravine, the indomitable warrior rushed to his right, attracted by the intense fire, where he noticed some hesitation among the troops of 1 Corps. He rushed into the Sebenovsko Redans with Ledru. He reached the Redan nearest to the village and took it. The Westphalians occupied the same heights and were competing with the French. Daru and Damas were killed in the front ranks. The Viceroy, noticing the attack on the centre, advanced with his troops. Morand and Broussier crossed over the Kolosha. Delzon crossed the Voinka. The 106th Infantry Regiment took Borodino. Plauzon was killed by enemy fire. This regiment, carried away by its enthusiasm, exceeded its orders, left the village, and crossed the Kolosha. It attacked along the Moscow road, where a large force pushed it back. Its courage is punished by significant losses, but it kept Kutuzov on the back foot. During this demonstration, the Russian general anticipated an attack on his centre. The 106th Regiment returned to Borodino, in which Delzon's division remained for the battle despite enemy fire.
It really exemplifies the way in which Napoleon can motivate his men. So Napoleon's promising them, let's defeat the Russians at this battle, and then we can stay in warm winter quarters. Tsar Alexander is going to sign a peace treaty very soon, and then we can all go back home.
And also, look at the battles he mentions, because first of all, he's mentioning only battles that that have had the Russians in them.
Yes,
but he's missing one.
I know.
Yeah.
That's a very good observation, actually.
That's a little dig there from my side. Yeah, and then of course a great classical ringing end to that. Oh, it's like Shakespeare at Henry V, you know, and he will show his scars. I was there on St. Crispin's Day.
He knows. He knows that Moscow is nowhere to be seen, but he wants to create the myth that they were fighting underneath the walls of Moscow. That is something you do want to boast to posterity about, rather than, oh yeah, I fought this great battle on a field
somewhere. Yeah, I don't think I realized exactly about this, actually, about the high-level officer attrition in this sector of the field. You're losing Davout for a start, who's the principal guy in charge in that sector, I guess.
Yes.
I wonder if that has anything to do with with what he says about the Polish.
Yes, and he notes that Poniatowski's attack on Utitsa has proceeded very slowly. Remember that the route which Poniatowski has taken, the Old Smolensk Road, is fairly overgrown, and while it's passable, you can't be particularly quick. One of Napoleon's plans would have been to try to outflank the Russians on the left, and in order to do that, Poniatowski would need to make an early breakthrough. I mean, it's quite interesting about Ney. He seems to have been sidetracked because he sees the fierce fighting going on in Davout sector, and basically says, "I need to get in there to help." And this suggests that the Russians are putting up a very fierce defense. So this is where the Russian commander, Prince Kutuzov, begins his report to Alexander I about the battle that he fought. And the extract is read by Anna Vakulenko, who is one of a couple of Russians participating in this video.
Hi, my name is Anna, and I'll be reading Kutuzov's dispatch to Alexander I on the battle at Borodino. It's been a few years since I left school, but I still remember first encountering the Battle of Borodino properly, rather than being simply aware of the word. Due to the fact that in Russia, history was a required subject through middle and high school and was taught chronologically, I didn't come across Borodino in a historical context until the final year of middle school. However, that it was an event that left a big mark was obvious much earlier, as we studied Lermontov's epic poem Borodino at least a couple of years before it was covered in history lessons. Only a few of my classmates ever learned the whole poem by heart, but I suspect most Russians will recognize the following lines. «Скажи-ка, дядя, ведь недаром Москва, спаленная пожаром, была французу отдана». Or in English, tell me, uncle, that it wasn't for nothing that burnt-out Moscow was given over to the French. The dates in the following match the Gregorian calendar rather than the Julian calendar in use in Russia at the time. At 4 in the morning on the 7th of September, the enemy's first efforts were directed at the village of Borodino, which he sought to capture in order to support the center of his army and the actions on our left wing, which was attacked at the same time. His main batteries were located near the village of Shevardino. The first with 60 guns near the redoubt we left on the 5th of September fired at an oblique angle to our infantry line and the battery established on the heights, while the second with 40 guns a little to the left of the first directed its fire on the fortifications on our left wing. The enemy's attack on the village of Borodino was carried out with incredible speed, but the bravery of the Life Guard Jaeger Regiment, inspired by the example of its commanders, halted the advance of 8,000 Frenchmen. The bloody battle intensified, and these brave Jaegers held the enemy for more than an hour, witnessed by the entire army. Finally, the enemy's reserves, which had arrived, strengthened his force and forced this regiment to leave the village of Borodino and cross behind the river College. The French, encouraged by taking Borodino, pursued the Jaegers and almost crossed the river with them, but the Guard Jaegers, reinforced by Colonel Monachtin's regiments and the Jaeger Brigade of the 24th Division under the command of Colonel Vuj, suddenly turned against the enemy and, together with the reinforcements, attacked with bayonets, and all the French who had crossed to our bank were the victims of their daring enterprise. The bridge on the river College was completely destroyed, despite heavy enemy fire, and for the whole day the French did not dare to attempt to cross and satisfied themselves with exchanging fire with our Jaegers. Meanwhile, the fire on our left wing intensified hour by hour. In this sector the enemy had gathered his main forces made up of the corps of Prince Poniatowski, Marshals Ney and Davout, and significantly outnumbered us. Prince Bagration, seeing the enemy's increase in numbers, summoned the 3rd Infantry Division under the command of Lieutenant General Kanovnitsyn, and moreover was forced to use the 2nd Grenadier Division from the reserves under the command of Lieutenant General Berezdin, which he placed in an echelon formation across the left wing behind the village, and further to the left 3 regiments of the 1st Cuirassier Division and the entire 2nd Cuirassier Division. I found it necessary to bring regiments closer to this sector. The Life Guard Izmailovsky Regiment and the Litovsky under the command of Colonel Khrapovitsky. The enemy under the cover of his batteries appeared from the wood and headed straight for our fortifications, where they were met with the full fire of our artillery, which was commanded by Colonel Boguslavsky, and sustained the heaviest losses. In spite of this, the enemy deployed in several deep columns, with the assistance of a large number of cavalry, furiously threw themselves at our fortifications. The artillerymen, with brave calmness, waited for the enemy to come into range of canister shot, opened heavy fire. Simultaneously, the infantry also responded with the most fervent musket fire, but the casualties suffered by their columns did not hold the French, who sought to carry out their objectives and did not turn to flight before Count Vorontsov and the combined grenadier battalions attacked them with bayonets. The powerful attack of these battalions disrupted the enemy, who retreated in the greatest disorder and was completely annihilated by our brave troops. During this attack, Count Vorontsov, receiving a serious wound, was forced to leave his division. Meanwhile, in another sector, the enemy infantry followed the old Smolensk road in order to completely outflank our left wing. But the 1st Grenadier Division, positioned on this road, awaited the enemy with firmness and halted his progress and forced him to turn back. Fresh forces reinforced the French and forced Lieutenant General Tuchkov to retreat along the Smolensk road, where he took up an advantageous position on the heights. The battery of the 1st Artillery Brigade, established on this position, inflicted significant damage on the advancing enemy. The French recognized the importance of this position because this hill commanded its surroundings. If they could capture it, they could take the flank of our left wing and deprive us of the means of holding the Smolensk road. Therefore, strengthening their assault on the position, they attacked the 1st Grenadier Division in closed columns from different sides. The brave grenadiers awaiting the enemy opened terrible fire and without a moment's hesitation charged with bayonets. The enemy was not able to resist such a determined attack, withdrew with losses and hid in the neighboring woods. Lieutenant General Tuchkov was wounded with a bullet to the chest, and Lieutenant General Sufyev took his command. At 11 o'clock the enemy, strengthening his artillery and infantry against the fortifications on our left wing, decided again to attack them. On several occasions his attacks were repulsed, where Major General Dorokhov made a significant contribution with excellent bravery. Finally, he managed to capture our 3 flèches, from which we were unable to withdraw our guns. But he did not enjoy this success for long. The Astrakhan, Siberian, and Moscow regiments, organized into closed columns under the command of Major General Borozdin, furiously charged at the enemy, who was immediately beaten back and pursued to the woods with significant losses. Such a blow was not without losses from our side. Major General Prince Karl of Mecklenburg was wounded. Major General Alexander Tuchkov was killed at the head of the Revel Infantry Regiment. Colonel Shatilov of the Moscow Grenadier Regiment received a serious wound. Colonel Buxgevden of the Astrakhan Grenadier Regiment, despite receiving 3 heavy wounds, continued forwards and fell dead on the battery with many other brave officers. The losses of the French were far more significant than ours. After this, the enemy, strengthening his forces, desperately charged again at our batteries and captured them for a second time. But Lieutenant General Kanovnitsyn, hurrying with his 3rd Division and seeing our batteries captured, ferociously attacked the enemy, instantly recaptured them. All the guns that were on them were again recaptured by us. The field between the batteries and the wood was covered with their corpses, and in this case they lost their best cavalry General Montbrun and General Remeuf, who was Chief of Staff to Marshal Davout. After these misfortunes, the French, taking several columns of both infantry and cavalry to the right, decided to outflank our batteries. They had hardly appeared from the wood when Lieutenant General Prince Golitsyn, commanding the cuirassier divisions located to the left of the 3 infantry divisions, ordered Major General Borodino and Major General Duka to strike at the enemy. In an instant he turned to flight and was forced to hide in the woods, from where, although they made an appearance on several occasions, were always driven back with losses.
Any after-battle report by the senior commander is obviously fascinating reading to see how they report the battle. And obviously, in this case, it's very interesting how he spins it to Alexander. He focuses in on the enemy batteries, the enemy artillery positions, and he talks about an oblique angle on the infantry.
Yes.
That's interesting to start off with, because he's starting off by saying that they had an incredibly good, they sighted their artillery very well. That means they're firing at an angle on infantry positions.
You can mow down ranks.
Yeah.
And that's sort of by virtue of actually the position that Kutuzov has chosen.
He also talks about the beginning of the battle, which the French account doesn't, which is the battle for Borodino, and then he moves over to the left flank.
Kutuzov sees what's going on, or he receives reports of what's going on, and he realizes that Bagration is not having a great time, and therefore he has to also mobilize the guard regiments, and it is these guard regiments who play a massive role in the Russian defense.
Yeah, these are highly motivated battalions here. I was actually talking about this not too long ago. Why do you have guard regiments? What makes them special? What makes them special is you can depend on guard regiments to do what professional soldiers do. Any other regiment, unless it's extremely experienced, cannot be depended on to be cool under fire and to absorb a great amount of pressure without cracking, and to move the way you want them to move, which is very slowly and deliberately and with a great amount of resolution. And so that's what is giving Davout a headache here now.
It's also quite interesting because on several occasions, Kutuzov basically tells about, the French came at us very heavily, but then a couple of our regiments were introduced to the fight and completely beat them back to the woods, and they wanted to hide and they were crying. And
Kutuzov isn't really trying to paint a history of the battle here. He's obviously trying to show Alexander we did quite well.
But essentially what he's trying to say is we fought well, we won a victory, and by the way, we retreated. And at this point, Kutuzov also remarks on the casualties on the Russian side. So you had Pelet writing about the casualties on the French side, but obviously there are also quite heavy casualties on the Russian side. One nickname for the Battle of Borodino, at least in Russian, is the Battle of Generals, because so many generals were either killed or wounded on the battlefield. The next extract comes from Eugene Labaume's account of the Russian campaign. And Labaume was an artillery general who was serving in Prince Eugene de Beauharnais' 4th or Italian Corps during the battle, and therefore involved in the attack on the Great Redoubt. The extract is read by Claudia Collier.
My name is Claudia Collier. I'm an art historian and City of London guide, and I have a special interest in the cultural and social impact of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. For this project, I'm going to read a complete account of the Russian campaign in 1812 by Eugene Labaume, who was an ordnance officer serving in Eugène de Beauharnais' 4th Corps. At the same time, the Zone division marched on Borodino, which the enemy had already set on fire. Our soldiers crossed the stream and reached the village, which they took with bayonets. They were ordered to confine themselves to occupying the position, but carried away by the natural fervor of the French, they crossed the Kolocha River and seized one of the bridges which connected the village to the plateau. General Plauzon seeking to moderate the courage of the 106th Regiment, hurried to this point to prevent them from advancing and was shot in the abdomen. At this moment, it cannot be too much to celebrate the dedication of the 92nd, which, seeing that the 106th had ventured over, crossed the Borodino bridge and managed to bring back this regiment, which without their assistance would have been enveloped. While regimental commander Boisserolles secured possession of Borodino, Broussier's division, crossing the Kolocha below the plateau, managed to occupy a ravine near the Great Redoubt, where it was subject to terrible enemy fire. On this day, the Viceroy, in addition to the command of his corps, also had under his orders Morand and Gerard divisions, the 1st and 3rd of 1st Corps, as well as General Grouchy's cavalry. At 8 o'clock, Morand division, which formed the extreme right of 4th Corps, was fiercely attacked as it prepared to advance on the redoubt, a movement which was supposed to be supported by Gerard's division. General Morand, in order to hold back the enemy lines, detached the 30th Regiment on his left to seize the redoubt. This position was captured through a great demonstration of valor. Our batteries duly occupied the heights and retained the advantage which the Russians had had for more than 2 hours. The parapets turned against us during the attack were now turned in our favor. The battle was lost for the enemy, who did not think it had started. In this extremity, Prince Kutuzov did not despair of the fate of his country. To save it and to support a reputation acquired by half of a century of service, he harangued the generals, revived the soldiers, and renewed the combat, attacking with all his troops the strong positions he had just lost. 300 of our pieces of cannon, placed on this high ground, bore down upon these masses, and their vanquished soldiers came to die at the foot of these ramparts, which they had erected and which they regarded as if it were a street in Moscow, their holy and sacred city. However, the 30th Regiment, attacked by 5 lines of infantry, was unable to remain in the redoubt which it had occupied. In vain, the 3rd Division, barely in the battle, hurried to secure it, but it was forced to concede it in the face of superior forces. This brave regiment, led by General Bonamy, having been surrounded on all sides, was forced to emerge from the redoubt and return without its chief to rejoin the division, which, alongside that of General Gerard, was always on the plateau and held back the multiple efforts from the Russians.
What do you think of this one then?
Firstly, it's just interesting to note that with all battle accounts, you are going to get some degree of bias towards the army you're fighting with. And I think that the most objective way we can interpret this is to say that the 106th had ventured too far and they were being attacked. And the 92nd was reinforcing them to try and hold back the enemy attacks. Your thoughts?
I think they're roughly the same. I think 106 got into a bad situation and it got attacked pretty heavily by the Russian Jaegers, and the 92nd had to come and pull it out basically. So they had to cover the retreat basically back across the river.
Yeah, I think that's what he's trying to say there. It's interesting that Labaume actually writes the battle was lost for the enemy who did not think it had started. So I think so the French realized that the redoubt was the key position, and essentially capturing the redoubt would mean winning the battle. And actually a few accounts later on also mention this. And so the fact that they actually managed to get hold of it pretty early on must have been a sign that things were going pretty well.
I thought it was very interesting how he described them defending the redoubt as if it was a street in Moscow. I think that's the most important. That's one of the most important lines.
So the next extract is essentially from the opposite side of the action, because it's from General Ivan Paskevich, who is the commander of the 26th Infantry Division, which occupies Great Redoubt during this action. And the extract is read by Konstantin from Russian Heritage in the UK, which is an organization dedicated to Anglo-Russian heritage and
goodwill and cultural exchange.
Indeed.
It's a very good Twitter account. You should all follow it.
Hello, my name is Konstantin Shlikov. I represent the Russian Heritage in the United Kingdom Society, and I will be reading Notes of the 1812 Campaign by Ivan Paskevich, Major General, Commander of the 26th Infantry Division. In the center, the Viceroy of Italy, Lieutenant General Ornano, on his right flank, occupied the village of Borodino with Delzon's division and established batteries on the heights, but they were silenced by our artillery several times. Beauharnais himself crossed the Caloche River with Marin, Gerard, Brustier's divisions and Grouchy's cavalry corps. But here they met my riflemen lying among the bushes through which the enemy had to pass. The French passed through the bushes with the greatest of efforts. For more than an hour, the Jaegers from my division held back their advance, and only at 10 o'clock was the enemy able to drive back my riflemen and enter the ravine directly opposite our Grand Battery. Brustier's division descended into the ravine between the battery and the village of Borodino. Marin and Gerard's divisions formed up in the same ravine and suddenly climbed out, preparing to attack the brigade on the battery, with the support of 2 more regiments behind them. Seeing that the enemy was preparing for an assault, I went out to meet them with the remaining regiments of my division. I concentrated my Jaegers and posted troops on both flanks of the redoubt, deploying the Nizhny Novgorod and Orel regiments on the right-hand side, the Ladога and 1 battalion of the Poltava on the left-hand side. The men of other battalions of the Poltava regiment were dispersed across the fortification and in the ditch. The 18th, 19th and 40th Jaeger regiments were placed behind the redoubt in reserve. Despite Russian artillery fire, the enemy division advanced. Although we were outnumbered by the enemy, I successfully held off the enemy's assault. Finally, the superiority of their numbers forced me to withdraw in order to reform my depleted regiments. General Bonamy's 30th Line Regiment, at the head of Marin's division, broke into our lines. He was supported by the entire division, but at this moment, under the cover of the Ufa regiment led by Count Kutuzov, I reorganized my division again and charged at the enemy with the 18th Jaeger Regiment. I recall the terrible sight that appeared before me during the struggle for the main battery. The 19th and 40th Jaeger regiments attacked the enemy from the left flank. General Vasilchikov and several regiments of the 12th Division fell upon them from the right flank. The 30th French regiment was almost completely destroyed. General Bonamy was taken into captivity. The remainder of his regiment was driven back towards Marin's division. I led the remaining regiments of the 12th Division, went behind the redoubt to cut off the French troops I found there. Reinforced by cavalry attacks, our powerful offensive demonstrations threw Marin's division into disarray. The enemy's withdrawal in this sector almost caused his troops, who had captured the village of Simonovskaya, in the meantime to follow suit. But Voronezh managed to reinforce Moran with Gerard's division, and the struggle was renewed. Then we regained control of the redoubt within a quarter of an hour. This struggle was one of the most terrible and bloody during the whole of the Battle of Borodino. The bodies of the enemy piled up in the redoubt in front of the fortification. From our side, General Kutuzov was killed. A horse was killed from under me, and another wounded. The Viceroy, failing to capture the redoubt through the assault, intensified the fire from his batteries against the fortification and our troops. My division, which had already lost almost half its men under the terrible fire from the enemy artillery, which slaughtered whole rows of men, stood their ground with incredible courage, as the French themselves acknowledged. Showered with canister, it suffered such great casualties that it was forced to withdraw from the front line to be replaced by General Lyachov's 24th Division, taken from the center of General Dokhrov's 6th Corps.
I like Paskevich's account because it's very immediate, and he's again talking about the action. So he's talking about the action on the right, talking about the Jaegers again.
As with a lot of Napoleonic battles in this point, yeah, you generally get a sort of skirmish between the light infantry first. Their job was to sort of soften up the attackers before they came crashing against the main line. Paskewich describes, I recall the terrible sight that appeared before me during the struggle. And bear in mind, Paskewich is writing this several decades after the fact.
It's one of those very vivid accounts written by a guy who saw it, who has never forgotten.
And then he talks about the casualties.
Yeah, he's just talking about losses from here on in, really, isn't he?
And the fact that the 26th Division lost half its men due to fire from the enemy artillery, and we talked about this before. The oblique fire that the French batteries can get on the redoubt means that it's very difficult for the infantry to stay put. The next account is by Colonel Waldemar Lowenstern, and the extract is read by Konrad Kinch.
Memoirs of Russian Major General Waldemar Lowenstern, 1777 to 1858. Colonel, Senior Aide-de-Camp to Barclay de Tolly. Just as I raised my sabre to strike at a French officer, General Bonamy, who did not want to surrender, and who was trying to hold one of the embrasures of the redoubt, I received a grape-shot ball in my right arm. General Yermolov was shot in his neck. Colonel Kikin the same. Count Kutuzov was killed, Peterson wounded. In fine, nearly all the persons of note who assisted in the recapture of this redoubt were put out of action. General Barclay arrived during the struggle. He ordered me to withdraw. Sent me a junior officer from the Mariupol Hussars, whom he ordered to accompany me, and I went to find an ambulance and to get a bandage. Along the way, I passed in front of the Guard Cavalry Corps. My cousin Karl de Budberg, head of His Imperial Majesty's Cuirassier Regiment, offered me a cart, which I did not accept on the assumption that he might need it himself later. I was not mistaken, because several hours later he was seriously wounded. Meanwhile, the brave Lowenwolde, who commanded the Chevalier Guard and with whom I was still talking to 20 minutes earlier with a good glass of liqueur, was killed in a brilliant cavalry charge which he executed with his fine regiment. I arrived at an ambulance where I was aggrieved to see Prince Bagration sitting on the grass, surrounded with many medical officers and his aide-de-camp. He was wounded, his leg was bare, and Wiley, the Emperor's surgeon, was busy extracting a ball, which had entered into his leg bone. He suffered much, but accepted it with heroism. Upon seeing me, he asked me, "How is General Barclay? Tell him that the fate of the army is in his hands. Everything is going well so far." He noticed that I was also wounded. "Ah," he said, "go and get bandaged." I left him with regret. He fought valiantly on the left wing. The main attacks were directed against him. Unfortunately, the prince was mortally wounded. General Chuchkov the same. Count Vorontsov, who commanded the grenadiers, and Count de Saint-Priest were also out of action. After he was finished with Prince Bagration, while he was kind enough to take care of me and bandage me with the last device he had left, so much so that he'd already used it. My injury was not dangerous, but the bruise was large and the pain was great. I put my arm in a sling, I changed horses, and I ran again to throw myself into all the horrors of combat. I joined General Barclay, who always sought out the places where the danger was greatest. I was fortunate enough to warn him of a bullet which ricocheted right at him. I suddenly took his horse by the bridle and pulled him aside, but the ball passed so close that he thought he was hit for a moment. He thanked me without paying much attention. His great soul was occupied with many other matters than that of the safety of his person.
Lowenstern's account is quite interesting because he is obviously on the side of General Barclay, painting a picture of how Barclay is playing a crucial role in this battle and almost micromanaging.
All I can say about it is that it's astounding again. He's talking astounding the officer casualties, and now it's Bagration and the very famous scene we've already talked about. At this stage, Barclay, who he's saying is like always seeking out the places of danger, is like one of the last senior officers alive.
As we know, Barclay and Bagration have not been on good terms over the course of most of this campaign, and they've been plotting against each other, and essentially there's a lot of bad blood between the two. But Lowenstern's account of a mortally wounded Bagration telling Barclay, or passing the message on to Barclay, that actually the fate of the army is in his hands, and that Barclay is he's been the guy who has saved the army over the course of the retreat at Smolensk, at Valutina, despite difficulties and mistakes. But Barclay has seen all this through, and he is still there. He's been there all the time. Kutuzov has not been there for a long time at all. So Barclay has is communicating his respect and his trust in Barclay to make sure that at least the Russian army will be saved in the battle. And avoiding defeat is essentially victory. The next extract is from Fyodor Glinka, who is an adjutant to General Miloradovich at Borodino. And it's from his essays on the Battle of Borodino, which is not quite an account of the battle as such, but a more analytical take on the battle. But we thought to include this as a result of the wonderful descriptions of two of the senior Russian generals. The extract is Michelle Herbelin, who is...
My name is Michelle Herbelin, and I have a master's degree in history from the University of South Carolina. Although my primary research interests are in the US, Mexico, and Texas from roughly the 18-teens through 1840s, a history of Russia course I took during my undergrad work at Baylor left me with a lasting interest in the 1812 campaign and with Prince Pyotr Bagration in particular. Let's just say that while my term paper for that course might have been on Russian California, my mind and heart were at the Battle of Borodino. So I'm excited to be reading an excerpt from the account of Fyodor Glinka, adjutant to General Mikhail Miloradovich. The remnants of the French 30th Regiment were fiercely pursued by corps squadrons. They were sent there along with 2 regiments of dragoons, Siberian and Irkutsk, by General Barclay de Tolly. The indefatigable enemy made various attacks, which we managed to stop despite being in a weaker position. The French cavalry was reinforced by reserves and aimed straight at ours. Suddenly it charged into a gap between columns and infantry squares and appeared in the rear of 4th and 6th Corps. But our brave lads remained unbroken. The rear face of the square lit up, and the battalion fire was such that the enemy, driven far away, was ready to hide underground. Seeing the success of our infantry, our cavalry struck at the enemy and pursued it without taking a step backwards until it was protected by the walls of their infantry. Before the men on the field had time to rest and regroup, artillery roared from both sides. And while men were falling on both sides, the French cavalry time after time charged across the field and tangled with ours, either breaking us or being broken, during which General Barclay de Tolly was in command of this sector. Mikhail Bogdanovich Barclay de Tolly, the commander-in-chief of the First Western Army and also Minister of War, resembled a figure from classical history. On the day of the Battle of Borodino he acted with extraordinary selflessness. He had to win 2 victories, and it seems that he won them. The latter, over himself, was the most important. One could not look upon him without a special feeling of respect, as this man, through his willpower and moral values, placed himself above human nature. With icy coolness, which the heat of the Battle of Borodino could not melt, he sought out the most dangerous places. The commander's white horse was distinguished from afar under the black columns of smoke. A spirit of unshakable firmness and elevated thought was expressed through his bald forehead, his face honest and calm, distinguished by the stillness of his features, and his eyes, full of judgment. They searched in vain for any signs of discomfort in his face, betraying the anxiety of his soul. He kept everything to himself, except the love for the common cause. He appeared everywhere as a loyal subordinate and experienced commander. Most of the officers around him were wounded and killed, while he was saved by some higher power. I heard myself how the officers and even soldiers were saying, pointing at their honored commander, "He is seeking death." But death is more likely to come for those who try to avoid it. The 16 wounds he sustained at different times over the whole course of the service and his noble selflessness attracted involuntary respect for Mikhail Bogdanovich. He could be mistaken, but he could not deceive. Everyone was sure of this, even during that time when he led the retreat, or, as some called it, an exciting war. No one thought that he was intending to lead our army to destruction. But the Russian heart could not wait, and upon hearing the cries of the fatherland, begged for battle. But the leader of the retreat had one objective: to wage a Scythian war and entice the invader as far as possible. On the other side was another person who wrote himself into history, who, without ties or relations to Russia, only his personal dignity, obliged his contemporaries to universally respect him. I am not speaking of posterity. It does not look at relationships in the same way. Without asking, one could guess, at a first look at his physiognomy, which was purely Eastern, that his family comes from some region of Georgia, and this family was one of the most famous on the other side of the Caucasus. It was a family of royal heritage. But time and circumstances took everything away from them, except their symbolic hereditary coat of arms. It fell on one of their descendants, during the time of Suvorov's unforgettable victories, to spruce up his family tree with the beautiful son and heir of Italy, and to sprinkle its roots with his noble blood to obtain immortality on the day of the unparalleled struggle for the survival and existence of Russia. Both in the past and the present day, this man is familiar to everyone through his portraits, which resembled him closely. His height was a little above average, he was lean and firmly built, although a little out of proportion. His face was distinguished by 2 features, a nose much larger than average, and his eyes. Although his conversation might not have betrayed a great intellect, nevertheless upon parting from him you would consider him a very clever person, because his intelligence, even when he spoke about the most ordinary things, was communicated through his eyes, at which everyone was accustomed to looking for signs of the cunning schemes that they attributed to him. Moments of inspiration could be found in him, and this happened precisely in moments of danger. It seemed that the fire of battle kindled something in his soul, and the features of his face easily relaxed and developed some kind of general harmony. He was transformed from an ordinary man into a handsome general. His eyes lit up. He also commanded in a cloak, with a whip, on a plain mount, rushing ahead of the columns, so that from the commanding general he could become a simple warrior on the front ranks, This was our Prince Bagration.
It's interesting that Glinka mentions an episode, the destruction of the 30th Regiment of Infantry, French infantry. He's talking about Barclay being in on the counter-attack, and he has very sensibly sent cavalry to pursue the flying French infantry. I thought that was very interesting, how you can sort of build up a picture there. The thing about Bagration is, I mean, it's a great passage where he talks about the inspiring effect of Prince Bagration. I think it's a really good example of why to be dynamic is very important in a general in the 19th century, and that's why Bagration was absolutely the guy you needed in that sector.
Yeah, back then, generals would lead by example, and he was not one for hanging back like Kutuzov. He was in the thick of things, directing counterattacks, giving orders, and generally being controlled at the front line, and occasionally leading men into the battle himself. The next extract is from Avraam Norov, a 17-year-old ensign in the 2nd Light Company of the Russian Guard Artillery. The extract is read by Dr. Paul Keenan.
My name is Dr. Paul Keenan, and I'm a lecturer in the Department of International History at the London School of Economics. The account from which I'll read an excerpt today is written by Avraam Sergeyevich Norov. Norov is born in the autumn of 1795 in the Russian town of Saratov on the Volga River. By the time of the Battle of Borodino, he has achieved the junior officer rank of Praporshchik and is serving as part of the Guards Artillery Regiment. At Borodino, Norov sustains a serious injury, meaning that his leg has to be amputated below the knee. In spite of this injury, he continues to serve in the military until 1823, when he is allowed to retire with the rank of colonel. Norov is a fascinating individual in a lot of ways. He is well educated, despite having to stop his education prematurely in 1807. He reads and speaks a considerable number of both modern and ancient languages: English, French, German, Spanish, Italian, Latin, ancient Greek, Arabic, and even Hebrew. He travels extensively to Europe, for example in the early 1820s. He visits England in the late 1820s, and he travels twice to the Holy Lands, once in the 1830s and again at the beginning of the 1860s. He writes extensively about his travels. He also writes poetry and other prose. And he represents, therefore, this very interesting mix within this 1812 generation of a military career, followed in a lot of cases by other state service, as well as a literary and cultural interest. And, of course, it's also worth saying that he belongs to several Masonic lodges up until their outlawing in Russia in 1822. He has a connection to the momentous events of the 1820s. His brother, Vasily, who, like him, has served in the military in 1812, is a member of some of the proto-Decembrist groups and is arrested because of his connection with the Decembrists in January 1826 at the house of his friend Mikhail von Wiesing. Although he's not then exiled to Siberia with some of the other leading conspirators, nevertheless, he is swept up in that extensive investigation under Nicholas I in 1826. Avraam, by contrast, serves the state in a number of different ways. He becomes a senator. He serves as a member of the Ministry of Public Education, or Public Enlightenment as it's sometimes referred to. His literary pursuits see him join the Russian Academy as a member, and then subsequently the Russian Academy of Sciences in the 1850s. As mentioned previously, he publishes quite extensively, both from his travels and other works, and his literary endeavours bring him into contact with a number of the leading salons of the day. I think it's worth pointing out, of course, that akin with a number of other leading literary lights of this period, he is connected to Pushkin, and indeed forms quite a close friendship with Pushkin, who uses Norov's library for some of his work on the history of the Pugachev revolt. The account is taken from some notes that Norov wrote up and subsequently published in a journal in the 1860s, which were reflections on Tolstoy's War and Peace, according to the recollections of a contemporary. The position where we were deployed was unenviable. The enemy probably noticed our fresh battery approaching and began to target us. But in spite of this, we did not spare them, and we could dare to say that the actions of our artillery did more damage to them than theirs to us. We constantly witnessed their exploding shells. "It is our unicorn," said one, and then another of my artillerymen. My neighbour, Sub-Lieutenant Roslovyev, commanding the 9th and 10th guns, who constantly lost men and horses, was forced to change his position, move forward, and protected the lower part of his guns with a knoll in front of him. Our soldiers were much happier under this heavy fire than in reserve, where we were being targeted, unable to respond. I constantly sighted the 12th gun myself. At one point, when the bombardier Kurochkin was passing me a shell, an enemy shell struck him on the wrist. "Oh, my hand," he cried, waving his stump. Meanwhile, the standard bearer picked up the dropped shell and set it down the muzzle spattered with blood, which he wiped with his sleeve. "It is a shame about your hand," he replied. "But look over there. Usov has been struck down completely, but he is not saying anything." I turned around and saw the poor Usov lying at the base of the gun. He was probably killed by the same shell which tore away Kurochkin's hand. I regret that I have forgotten the name of the bombardier who displayed the characteristic humour of a soldier despite the tragic circumstances. The command of our battery soon passed to Staff Captain Stolypin. An enemy grenade severely concussed Captain Gogol and killed his horse from under him. We were protected by His Imperial Majesty's Cuirassier Regiment. Standing on the flank, I could not fail to notice the devastation which the enemy shells inflicted on the ranks of this fine regiment. A captain from the regiment rode up to me, his horse stubbornly walking across the body of his recently fallen horse, a Ukrainian stalwart, which was struck by a shell straight to the chest. It lay bravely as the officer's arm swung down with his sword. "Have you also suffered such hits?" the captain asked me. "Quite a few," I replied, "only we are engaged in action. But it is distressful to see you. Why don't you go back down this slope a little? You will always be in time to help us if cavalry is to charge us." "You are right," he said, stopping his horse, which winced and bucked from our loud shots. It seems he passed this on to his regimental commander, because soon after the regiment moved away from us. The line of smoke on the left flank, fading a little by the woods, skirted around them and showed us that behind these woods an important struggle was underway. The old Smolensk road passed through there. It was self-evident that Napoleon had not abandoned his intention to circumvent our left flank, and we often looked in that direction. But Tuchkov's corps stood there, and all of Poniatowski's efforts were frustrated by this obstacle. Although Tuchkov was left for a long time with a single division, being forced to relinquish the other to help Prince Bagration, and began to weaken in face of Poniatowski's attack, Kutuzov reinforced him with Al-Sufiev's division from Bagovut's corps. Tuchkov forced Poniatowski to retreat, but was himself mortally wounded, and Bagovut took his place. Napoleon, learning of Poniatowski's failure, seriously worried about the course of the battle if Tuchkov were to free himself from Poniatowski and swing around Ney and Murat's rear. At the same time, we received an unpleasant surprise with lateral enemy fire from the right of our battery. The reason for this was the kink in the line of our left flank. Upon the capture of the Semyonovskoye flèches by the French artillery fire directed our central battery, also known as the Raevsky, which was the subject of renewed efforts by the enemy to capture it, began to reach us. We therefore moved forward, but soon we saw before us ranks of the enemy cavalry. This was Latour-Maubourg's cavalry. Napoleon, temporarily enthused by the capture of the Semyonovsky flèches, ordered Murat with Nansouty and Latour-Maubourg's cavalry corps to decide the battle against us. From the Shevardino redoubt, he enthusiastically shouted, "There they go, there they go." This large swarm, threatening to rout us, crashed against the squares of our Izmailovsky and Lithuanian Guards regiments, but was then defeated by the Guards batteries of His Imperial Majesty and Count Arakcheyev, together with the 1st Light Company. Napoleon, of course, dreamed of Marengo and of Kellerman, but he was not fighting with the Austrians and soon gave way to frustration. A large part of his famous cavalry lay on the field and could no longer recover. Another cavalry attack was launched, but met with the same fate. The cavalry which appeared before us was preparing for a third attempt. Once again repulsed by the squares of our Guards regiments, it turned toward us and protected itself from its own artillery, gave us the opportunity to rest and to recover a little. Then His Imperial Majesty's Cuirassier Regiment advanced to meet the attack. Our battery commander Stolypin, upon seeing the cuirassiers manoeuvre, attached a limber, rode a short distance forwards, and after changing the front positions, waited for the enemy to close without firing. Our guns were loaded with canister. Stolypin intended to allow the enemy to approach to a short distance, send the enemy into disorder with heavy fire, and thus ensure success for our cuirassier. The enemy bravely advanced at a slow trot, straight towards the menacing battery awaiting it. But once the enemy cavalry was no more than 300 metres from the battery, which was already preparing to fire, this cavalry turned to both sides and presented a light horse battery, which had been hidden behind it, already detached from its limber. Both sides began to fire at the same time. The inevitable confusion temporarily reigned over the battery amidst canister at such close quarters. Several men and horses were taken out of action. But having engaged against cavalry, we were already ready for the next round, and I was still able to fire canister from my flank gun. This was my final greeting to the enemy. I suddenly felt an electric shock, fell by the gun, and saw that my left leg had been shattered into smithereens. I still saw how our cuirassier, being hitherto idle, rushed to attack. The position of the enemy battery was of course much worse than ours. The fire from one of our unicorns, loaded with grenades, tore open an ammunition box. In the thick cloud of smoke, it was impossible to make out what was happening. Thus the artillery duel came to an end. There was already no response from the enemy battery. Our cavalry, as I later learned, crushed the enemy and captured 2 of its 6 guns. At this time, my comrade, Junior Lieutenant Wachsmuth, was wounded by canister shot which struck him in his right shoulder blade. Wachsmuth's wound was quickly dressed by the soldiers, and he remained at the battery until the end of the battle, while Stolypin had his brave Highland horse killed from under him. I was already under the knife of the Izmailovsky Regiment's distinguished staff doctor, Kamianetsky, at the dressing station when the central battery was once again subjected to terrible carnage. But I will pause here for a while to say a few words about the spirit which animated our soldiers at that moment. My good friend in chief, Afanasy Stolypin, to whom I sent word that the flank gun was left without an officer, rode up to me, lamented over my fate, sent out to find more men, but none were found nearby. I was carried on my overcoat. We encountered a disabled gun driven by wounded lame horses, and I was somehow placed upon it. I was left with Bombardier Kozlov, who supported me. We moved slowly, avoiding the shells. Finally, we reached the intended destination near some sort of tent, in front of which wounded soldiers were lying and sitting on the grass patiently waiting for the line to come to them. The doctors, with their sleeves rolled up and stained with blood, ran up to one and then another. Piles of dismembered limbs lay in various places. I was placed before Kamianetsky, who was then amputating the arm of a grenadier, sitting on a rock. I turned to Kozlov. "Stay with me, my friend, until my men arrive from the convoy." He replied, "I request, Your Honour, since they are taking care of you for now, to allow me to return to the battery. Many men have been hit. Every man needs to be there." "The Lord be with you," I told him. "If I remain alive, then you will not be left without a reward." And he received a George Cross. Meanwhile, my comrade, Sergeant Dilov, who had been serving under Count Kutuzov and was sent by him with some orders, having heard from some that he was wounded and others that he was killed, looked for him everywhere and ran into me at that very moment when Kamianetsky was sharpening his instrument to operate upon me. Dilov asked me whether he could be of any assistance and did me a great favour. I asked him if he could get me some ice and take it to the company, which suffered great thirst due to the heat. To my surprise, he carried out my wishes. He found them and sent me 2 of my men. Even here, shells were disturbing the frantic work of our medics.
It's a brilliant extract, actually. It's because it's from a junior officer. These sort of narratives have to be viewed as sort of authentic descriptions of the individuals themselves. But it's it's really vivid, it's really visceral. It's quite undiluted in its way of trying to present the hell of being in an artillery battery at Borodino, and those poor cuirassiers behind him as well. You know, that's the French artillery again, which is just coming up in every single account almost. And he's got, I mean, obviously it's amazing to read how all these sort of almost mundane conversations that happen within this titanic battle, and of course the humor, the gallows humor of the soldiers, and some real insight into how artillery units behave under fire. They don't just stand in a big long line of guns and just pound away. They're actually trying to get better. Half the battery gets better position. Some of it's loaded with canister for safety. Some of it's firing round shot. It's really, really interesting account.
Yeah, and I also found it a very interesting account in terms of his description of being evacuated after being wounded and his leg being smashed into smithereens.
Yeah, okay.
And because bear in mind, you've got the battle raging on, and you've got men. Every man that can fight needs to be on the front lines. So even when it comes to evacuating wounded soldiers, it's basically we'll take you back, but we need to get back right to the fight, because every single man is needed to hold back the enemy in such an intense battle. And especially when it comes to artillery, like, it's one thing when you have your guns captured and every artillery commander and every general suffers a lot of humiliation for that. But there's also another element to this, which is losing your men and your officers who operate the guns.
But so that's a great account.
Yeah.
Very, very instructive, I think, on especially this part of the battle, which is getting very muddy with just constant counterattacks, and a massive artillery duel essentially is what it's devolving into.
So the next extract we have is from Philippe de Ségur's History of the Russian Expedition. And he's a general of brigade who is Napoleon's aide-de-camp and therefore by the side of the emperor. And the extract is read by Marcus Cribb.
History of the Russian Expedition. Philippe Paul, Comte de Ségur. General of Brigade, Napoleon's aide-de-camp. Read by Marcus Cribb. Manager of Apsley House and commentator on Wellington's life, including podcasts and videos. But I've been kindly asked to contribute to the commemorations of the Battle of Borodino, even though I mostly concentrate on the Peninsular War. The Napoleonic Wars need to be taken in context of all the flanks against Napoleon's conquests and invasions, and putting them together, you get multiple sides of the stories and how eventually they were able to bring down the conquering General Napoleon and return peace to Europe. The battle then ceased in the plain and became concentrated on the rest of the enemy's heights and near the great redoubt which Barclay, with the centre and the right, continued to defend obstinately against Eugene. In this manner, about midday, the whole of the French right wing, Ney, Davout and Murat, after annihilating Bagration and half the Russian line, presented itself in the half-open flank of the remainder of the enemy army, of which they could see the whole interior, the reserves and the abandoned rears, and even the commencement of the retreat. But as they felt themselves too weak to throw themselves into that gap, behind a line still formidable, they called aloud for the guard. The young guard, only let it follow them at a distance, let it show itself and take their place upon the heights. They themselves will then be sufficient to finish. General Belliard was sent by them to the emperor. He declared that from their position the eyes could penetrate without impediment as far as the road to Mozaik in the rear of the Russian army, that they could see there a confused crowd of flying and wounded soldiers and carriages retreating, that it was true that there was a ravine and a thin copse between them, but that the Russian generals were so confounded that they had no thought of turning these to any advantage, that, in short, only a single effort was required to arrive in the middle of that disorder to seal the enemy's discomfiture and terminate the war. The emperor, however, still hesitated, and ordered that general to go and look again, and to return and bring him word. Belliard, surprised, went and returned with all speed. He reported that the enemy began to think better of it, that the copse was already lined with his marksmen, that the opportunity was about to escape, that there was not a moment to be lost, otherwise it would require a second battle to terminate the first. But Bezier, who had just returned from the heights to which Napoleon had sent him to examine the attitude of the Russians, exerted that, far from being in disorder, they had retreated to a second position, where they seemed to be preparing for a fresh attack. The Emperor then said to Belliard that nothing was yet sufficiently unravelled that to make him give his reserves. He wanted to see more clearly upon his chessboard. This was his expression, which he repeated several times, and at the same time pointing on one side of the old Moscow road, of which Potowski had not yet made himself master, and on the other to an attack of the enemy's cavalry on the rear of our left wing, and finally to the great redoubt against which the great efforts of Prince Eugene had been ineffectual. Belliard, in consternation, returned to the King of Naples and informed him of the impossibility of obtaining the reserve from the Emperor. He said he had found him still seated in the same place, with a suffering and dejected air, his features sunk and a dull look, but orders languishingly, in the midst of those dreadful warlike noises to which he seemed completely a stranger. At this account, Ney, furious, hurried away by his ardent and unmeasured character, and exclaimed, "Are we then come so far to be satisfied with a field of battle? What business has the Emperor in the rear of the army? There he is, only within reach of reserves and not of victory. Since he will no longer make the war himself, he is no longer the general. As he wishes to be emperor everywhere, let him return to Tuileries and leave us to be generals for him." Murat was more calm. He had recollected having seen the emperor the day before, and he was riding along, observing that part of the enemy's line, halting several times, dismounting, and with his head resting upon the cannon, remained there for some time in the attitude of suffering. He knew what a restless night had passed, that a violent, incessant cough cut short his breathing. The king guessed that fatigue and the first attacks of the equinox had shaken his weakened frame, and that, in short, at the critical moment, the actions of his genius was in a manner chained down by his body, which had sunk under the triple load of fatigue, of fever, and of a malady, which is probably more than other prostrates the moral and physical strength of its victims. Still, further incitements were not wanting, for shortly after, Belliard de Roux, urged by Dumas and particularly by Berthier, said in a low voice to the Emperor that from all sides it was the cry that the moment was sending for the guard was now come. To which Napoleon replied, "And if there is to be another battle tomorrow, where is my army?" The minister urged no further, surprised to see for the first time the enemy putting off to the morrow and adjourning his victory.
It's fascinating to see how angry, well, hilarious how angry Ney gets, and Murat is like the voice of calm.
Murat is the voice of reason. How often does that happen?
I don't think it ever has happened. This is how crazy Borodino has become. But what I think the big question here that I want to raise is: was Napoleon correct to withhold the Imperial Guard? Now, the way it's painted here, even though it's critical, my instinct on it is actually to say he was right at this moment not to commit the Imperial Guard. I might be argued down by saying, yes, the young guard certainly could have been released. But as the account says, Napoleon said, Poniatowski is still messing around on over Dutitsa. Apparently, the road to Mezhaisk is not clear, and it's filled with Russian reserves.
Right.
And that means there's a lot of fighting still to be done. So I think there's actually a valid reason.
So we can see from Segur's description that there is actually some confusion among the generals around Napoleon as to the state of the Russian army at this point. And I think there was perhaps a rather small window during which Napoleon could have attempted to bring forward the guards and introduce them to reinforce Ney and Davout. And this is essentially after Bagration is mortally wounded, and the Russians are now desperate to try and organize themselves. And as I said, it's really only the 3 Guards infantry regiments who are maintaining the integrity of that line. There was perhaps the opportunity to really, force almost encircle the Great Redoubt. Well, they kind of did end up encircling the Great Redoubt. That's the problem.
See, this is where I'm coming from here.
Yeah.
In the way it went, they weren't able to take a convincing victory. And I actually think Napoleon here, for all it was criticized about his handling of the battle or non-handling of the battle, he could probably read a battle quite well. From my point of view, I think it's probably, if you think about just strictly sort of like what generals and serving officers would say, like, I don't know, like the rules, is that until Poniatowski can threaten the road to Mezhaisk, he shouldn't commit his crushing reserve, i.e. until you can sever the communication to safety and drive them against the river
right. Yeah.
Then that's what I think that's what he's thinking.
Yeah, and that does make sense. I would say that if Napoleon did have an opportunity to secure a decisive victory, it was quite a narrow window. The next extract is by the Prussian officer Carl von Clausewitz, who is more famous as the author of the treatise on war. But in 1812, he is a staff officer in the Russian army, and at Borodino, he is attached to the staff of General Fyodor Uvarov. This extract is read by Grace Mitchell.
Hello, my name is Grace Mitchell. You can use any pronouns for me. I lived in Russia for a while. I taught English and studied there. I was also the first American to participate in the World Equestrian Jigotovka Championship, equestrian jigotovka being a discipline of equestrian sport based on the Cossack arts of war. So I'm going to read a text that has to do with the Cossacks today. This is written by Carl von Clausewitz, who was an officer on the staff of General Fyodor Uvarov. Translated from German. Let's go. General Platov had been employed with some 2,000 Cossacks to discover a ford of the Kalocha on the Russian right, had passed over, and was astonished where he had expected to find the entire left wing of the enemy to meet with few or no troops. He was the left wing of the Viceroy moving against Borodino, and it seemed to him that nothing would be easier than to fall on its left flank, etc. Etc. we say because it is very usual that people don't know precisely what they are aiming at by such a flank attack. To go headlong on an exposed artillery of reserve, to capture ammunition wagons here and there, seems often, in prospect, of more importance than it really is. In short, Platov dispatched the Prince of Hesse-Philippsthal, who was with him as a volunteer, to General Kutuzov to acquaint him with the discovery he had made, and to make a proposal to throw a considerable body of cavalry over the river by the ford, and fall on the exposed flank of the enemy. The Prince of Hesse, who was perhaps more taken with the idea than Platov himself, but was a young officer without experience, betook himself to Colonel Toll, and represented the case with so much liveliness that at first it really had a winning appearance. Colonel Toll was gained over, and rode directly to Kutuzov, who was stationed near the village of Gorky. The author, who was at this moment quartermaster general to the 1st Cavalry Corps under Uvarov, happened to be in the suite of that general, close to Kutuzov, when Colonel Toll rode up. The latter had just returned from the left wing, and brought a report that all was going on favorably, Prince Bagration having repulsed every attack. In the first 2 hours of the action, it could not well be otherwise. At the same moment, an account arrived that in the redoubt of the centre, which had for a moment been regained from the French who had stormed it, the King of Naples had been taken prisoner. The enthusiasm blazed up like lighted straw. Several voices proposed to make this known to all the troops. Some calmer heads among the general officers thought the fact so improbable as to require further confirmation. It was, however, believed for half an hour, although no King of Naples made his appearance, which was accounted for by the supposition of his being severely wounded. We now know that it was General Bonamy, and not the king, whom the French had left wounded in the redoubt. It was in this enthusiasm and the belief of a successful turn of affairs that the proposal of the Prince of Hesse was laid before Kutuzov by Colonel Toll, and it was plain that this officer, too much carried away by the pervading feeling, believed that a lively diversion with a corps of cavalry on the enemy's left would strike an effectual blow and perhaps decide the battle. He proposed, then, to apply to this purpose the 1st Cavalry Corps, which consisted of 2,500 horses of the light cavalry of the Guard, and which, placed behind the right wing, had hitherto stood idle. Kutuzov, who had been listening to all the reports and discussions like one who did not know exactly whether he stood on his head or his heels, and only from time to time said, "It's fine, do it," replied also to this proposal, "It's fine, take it." The Prince of Hesse had offered to guide the corps through the ford to the point in question. General Uvarov, therefore, was ordered to follow his guidance, and having arrived, to fall on the enemy in the flank and the rear. This instruction was certainly a usual one, and the circumstances hardly admitted of more detailed orders. But according to our experience of military matters, we could hardly consider it satisfactory. A due estimate of the magnitude of the undertaking was wanting. If it could be determined, in the face of a superior enemy, to give out of hand, and to abstract from the order of battle 2,500 horsemen, it ought to have been capable of demonstration that they would be of real use where they were going. That the General Uvarov was to attack any inferior or equal cavalry force he might fall in with was the nature of his commission, but it was easy to foresee that he would also fall in with infantry, and if his movement was to take serious effect, an infantry in force, and combined with artillery. We know well, however, how it fares when a single arm is opposed to 2 others. General Uvarov had, it is true, 12 pieces of flying artillery with him, but this was an unimportant fraction among such masses of artillery as were used in this action. It is, then, our opinion that they should have made it the duty of General Uvarov to attack whatever he met with, and have contemplated not so much a decisive advantage as a brisk attack, which would employ a considerable mass of the enemy, and withdraw it from the attack of the Russian position. Under this view, even General Uvarov's ultimate failure might not have been considered a calamity. Such a commission is always disagreeable and requires much self-denial and good humor. It is not, however, to be expected that any general will act in this sense without specific orders. He will rather follow the common rule, seek for an equal contest, and avoid a hopeless one. At the moment when this operation was determined on, between 8 and 9 a.m., the battle was in its first stage of development. Not the least of its ultimate results could be foreseen. A long day of 12 hours was before us, and from the characteristic obstinacy of our adversary, fresh exertions were to be expected to the last moment. It was a realization of the proverb not to praise the day until evening has arrived. A diversion by 2,500 horse could not possibly have a decisive influence on a battle delivered on one side by 130,000 men. It could at best put a spoke in the wheel of their plans for a moment, and astonish them more or less. Had this been entered upon at a moment when the decision was at hand, when exhaustion on both sides was sure to give effect to any exertion of remaining force, something might have been expected from it. At such an early hour, however, the enemy had manifestly time to gather an overwhelming force against this isolated attack, to beat General Uvarov out of the field, and return afterwards to its own business on hand. He passed the Kalocha by a ford above Staria, and then brought his right shoulder forward, and took a direction towards Borodino, in pursuing which, however, he was obliged, on account of some marshy rivulets which fall into the Kalocha, to incline sensibly to the right. It was between 11 and 12 when he reached the brook which flows by Borodino into the Kalocha. The village lay on his left, in which the troops of the viceroy had established themselves. Before him was the brook, which runs through swampy meadows. On his side of it stood a couple of regiments of cavalry and a mass of infantry, which might be a regiment or a strong battalion. The French cavalry retired immediately over a dam, which crosses the brook at about 2,000 paces from Borodino. The infantry, however, was bold enough to remain, and form square with the dam in their rear. General Uvarov attacked. The author suggested in vain that the artillery should first open upon them, but the Russian officers feared that they would then retire and escape capture. The hussars of the guard were therefore advanced and ordered to charge. They made 3 ineffectual attacks. The infantry, Italian troops, lost neither their composure nor their ranks and returned a steady fire. The hussars retired, as usually happens in such cases, some 30 pace, and withdrew out of fire. General Uvarov then discontinued these not very brilliant attempts and caused the artillery to open. At the first discharge, the enemy retired over the defile. The whole affair then came to an end. Borodino itself could not be attacked with cavalry. The brook could only be crossed by cavalry at the dam. On the other side of this were discovered on hilly ground, with much brushwood, from 4,000 to 5,000 infantry, in single bodies. The cavalry was behind these. In Borodino were seen some strong columns, and towards the French center, behind the line of battle, large masses in repose, which we supposed to be of the Guard. General Platov, with his 2,000 Cossacks, was a quarter of a league to the right of Uvarov, and looking for a passage over the marshy stream. At the time of General Uvarov's arrival, several hours of the hottest conflict had passed away. The Russians began to look on things with a different eye from that of 8 and 9 a.m. They felt the whole weight of the giant now upon them, and themselves hardly equal to the burden. The corps of Bagavut and Osterman, which had been placed inactive on the right, had been applied to the support of the left and center, and even the Guards had sent a portion of their ranks into the fight. The reserves thus began to be deficient, while the French Guards, some 20,000 strong, stood motionless in heavy columns like a thundercloud. The Russians could contemplate no offensive movement other than that confided to General Uvarov. To that officer all eyes were now turned, and an aide-de-camp, an officer of the general staff, and an aide-de-camp of the Emperor rode up in succession to see whether anything could possibly be done in this quarter. All order back with the conviction that General Uvarov could effect nothing. It both seemed no trifling matter to pass this brook under the fire of the enemy, and so many troops were seen standing idle as reserves on the other side that it was plainly impossible for 2,500 horse to effect the result of battle by any effort in that quarter. The author thanked God that he had become a nullity on this occasion, and was unable to take part in the discussions which passed between General Uvarov and the officer dispatched to him. He was, from the beginning, convinced that this diversion could produce no result, and now saw plainly that if anything was to be made of it, some young fire-eater, who had his reputation to make, would have been the man for the service, and not General Uvarov. During these deliberations, which occupied some hours, there suddenly arose a heavy fire beyond the stream, out of the brushwood, upon the left wing of the French, and the account was soon spread that Platov had at length found a passage with his Cossacks, and was in the wood on that side. We saw, in fact, these troops, so remarkable for wonderful transitions from the extreme of timidity to that of daring, careering about among the masses of infantry without making any decided attack, as if skirmishing. The troops immediately in our front feared to be locked into the morass, and made a side movement. The Cossack regiment of the Guard, attached to Uvarov's corps, could stand it no longer. Like a rocket with its tail, they were over the dam like lightning, and into the wood to join their brethren. Uvarov unquestionably might have followed at this moment, but he had no desire to let himself be squashed in the defile if repulsed, or to have to make a retreat in loose formation, as the Cossacks are accustomed to do on occasion. Having also dispatched messengers in all directions to Kutuzov, Bennigsen, and Barclay, he remained, waiting for further orders. Before long, the Cossacks of the Guard returned, with a considerable deficit in killed and wounded.
So Clausewitz's account of Uvarov and Platov's cavalry attack on the French left is quite interesting, because he makes it very clear that he thinks it's not a very good idea.
It's a brilliant account because of its just unvarnished acerbity. It's his softly mocking tone about everything, basically saying, and he's basically arguing to the Russian army of then, who was saying, why did this great attack fail? He's basically just sort of going, why are you so surprised, you idiots? I saw it.
Absolutely.
Uvarov doesn't appear to have had the greatest kind of enthusiasm for the plan. And his attack on Eugene's squares seems to kind of bear that out. Right. He really wasn't. He knew he only had cavalry. I can't break Eugene's flank with this lot. So he just like charged them a few times, and we'll wait for orders to withdraw. And then suddenly in the distance, Platov's Cossacks and Clausewitz is very complimentary to the Cossacks, actually, really. He says he identifies what they do and why they're good at it. But what's hilarious is that the Guard Cossacks see the dirty online Cossacks going at it, and they can't be restrained.
Wait. Yeah. We're Cossacks as well, you know. We can do that.
And so why are we just standing here? Let's go, boys. By accident, they bought yet more time for the Russian army to recover the final act.
And Clausewitz actually mentions it himself at the beginning of the extract when he says, etc., because no one really knows what this is going to achieve. But...
that's a brilliant bit about it, isn't it? He actually uses that etc. like a knife.
So yeah, I guess that's Clausewitz.
That's Clausewitz. A very enjoyable account it was too. I believe we go back to the French now, don't we?
Yes. So this next extract is from the memoirs of General Armand de Caulaincourt, who is master of the horse in the imperial suite and therefore pretty much standing next to Napoleon for much of the battle. And the extract is read by Jason Hughes.
Hi, I'm Jason Hughes. I'm an undergraduate history major at the University of Oklahoma, and my main interests are in Napoleonic history and the Age of Revolutions. Today, I'll be reading an excerpt from General Caulaincourt's memoirs focusing on the Battle of Borodino. The account itself offers a glimpse into the chaos of Napoleon's headquarters during the battle, and a nearly bird's-eye view of the battle due to Caulaincourt's rank and closeness to Napoleon. Before I get started, I would also like to thank Napoleonic Impressions for letting me take part in the Voices of Borodino project, which I think is a fantastic way of commemorating such a bloody and important battle. At 8 o'clock, the Emperor was informed that Montbrun, general of division and commander of the 1st Cavalry Corps, composed of 3 divisions, had been killed. He recalled my brother, whom he had sent to the right, and who came up a moment later to announce the taking of the 2 redoubts and the subsequent successes. "Go and take command of the 1st Cavalry Corps," the Emperor said to him. "Do as you did at Arzobispo." The Prince of Neuchâtel drew him up a written order to show to the generals of division. My brother seized my hand, saying, "With things this hot, I don't suppose I shall see you again. We shall win, or I shall get myself killed." His chronic sufferings often may have desired death. Did they now conjure up in him this mortal presentiment? Or was it possibly the heat of the action? I do not know, but I cannot rid my mind of the solemnest farewell until an even more fatal event occurred to confirm the foreboding which had overtaken me. Supported by part of the Viceroy's corps, Marshal Ney was backing up the right, and by 10 o'clock, the enemy had lost all the ground in front of the great redoubt at their center. They had consequently lost the position on the left and the village that supported their center, but the reserves were coming up. For a moment, success hovered between the 2 sides towards our right, and we even had to draw in our advanced troops to the main body while falling back on the captured redoubts. A formidable array of guns spat forth death in every direction. The Russian infantry made fresh efforts to regain their lost ground. The great redoubt belched out a veritable hell on our center. In vain did Marshal Ney and the Viceroy combine their forces to attack it. They were repulsed. Returning to the attack a second time, they were no more fortunate, and Ney even lost a little ground. A section of the guard, which had followed by echelons the movement of the corps which united the center to the right, took up a position from which, if necessary, they could support this corps if the momentary forced retirement should become more serious. But our artillery checked the dash of the enemy, who had for a long time stood firm under the fire of a devastating bombardment. Finally, they were forced to yield the ground which we had previously taken from them. All this time, the Emperor was watching the movements at the center. He had stationed himself opposite the last redoubt we had taken, and he gave a general order to halt for the moment and hold the positions we occupied, so as to give the artillery time, he said, to demolish these masses of infantry which stood motionless. It was then nearly 11 o'clock. Shortly before this, Lieutenant General Likhachev and some 15 prisoners taken in the redoubt were brought to him. The officer in charge of them told the Emperor that they had put up a gallant defense. The Emperor received the general well. Seeing that his prisoner was without a sword, he expressed regret that he had been disarmed. "I respect the courage of the unfortunate too much, sir," he said, "not to give myself the pleasure of returning his arms to a brave man." With that, he handed the general his sword and asked him some questions. He then gave orders that the other prisoners should be questioned, taken care of, and treated, as the general had been, with the utmost respect. This capture gave the Emperor great pleasure, but it seemed inconceivable to him that so few prisoners had been taken when these redoubts had been captured in such a rush and entirely surrounded by the King of Naples' cavalry. He complained bitterly and asked a number of questions about it, not concealing the fact that he had desired and hoped for other results. "We shall win the battle," he said. "The Russians will be crushed, but it will not be conclusive if I do not take prisoners." He showed signs of anxiety. Between noon and 1 o'clock, the Emperor ordered the Viceroy to resume the offensive and support the left of Marshal Ney, who was already supporting General Junot. The right, reinforced by the Young Guard, likewise had orders to push forward. The enemy, smashed by the guns and pressed simultaneously on all points, massed their troops and held firm despite the ravages made in their ranks by the guns. The Emperor then climbed into the redoubt to follow with his own eyes and direct the general movement he had ordered all along the line. Our troops redoubled their efforts without gaining ground. The fire increased to greater intensity. We were at grips at all points. It was at this moment that my brother, having put into motion 2 of his divisions, supported by 2 battalions of infantry, placed himself at the head of the 5th Cuirassiers to lead the troops under his command on the Great Redoubt, and thus ensure the success of this attack, already attempted in vain several times. He drove out the enemy, and from that moment the battle was won, as the Emperor himself said, for the Russians at once began a general retreat. I think it was about 3 o'clock when an aide-de-camp arrived in hot haste to tell the Emperor that the Great Redoubt had been taken by my brother, and the enemy was retiring at all points. An instant later, Monsieur Waldemar, my unfortunate brother's aide-de-camp, who had not quitted his side, brought the Emperor the details of this affair, and told him that my brother had been killed by a bullet below the heart, just as he was coming out of the redoubt to pursue the enemy who had rallied at some distance, and were advancing to retake it. I was at the Emperor's side when this report was brought. I need not attempt to describe my feelings. He has died as a brave man should, said the Emperor, and that is in deciding the battle. France loses one of her best officers. His Majesty immediately set off at a gallop in front of the cavalry to join the King of Naples and make such dispositions as he considered necessary to assure and follow up this success. Marshal Ney and the Viceroy had supported the decisive movement of General Caulaincourt. The enemy's counterattack on the Great Redoubt was in vain, and the Russians were forced to retreat along the whole of their front. One redoubt still remained to them, as well as a little fieldwork that commanded the Moscow road, and seemed as though they wished to hold them. A thick wood covered their march and concealed their movements from us at this point. The Emperor flattered himself that the Russians were going to hasten their retreat, and he reckoned on hurling his cavalry on them in an attempt to break them. The Young Guard and the Poles were already on the march toward these outworks, which the Russians held. In order to make out their movements, the Emperor went with the sharpshooters. Bullets whistled around him, but he had made his escort stay behind. Seeing me at his side, the Emperor told me to go back. It is over, he said. Go and wait for me at headquarters. I thanked him, but remained with him. The Emperor was certainly running a great risk, as the fusillade became so lively that the King of Naples and several generals hurried up to urge him to retire. The Emperor then went in front of the columns that were coming up. The Old Guard followed them, the Carabineers and the cavalry marching in echelon. The Emperor seemed determined to carry these last Russian fieldworks, but the Prince of Neuchâtel and the King of Naples pointed out to him that the troops were marching thither without any commander, that nearly all the divisions in the army had likewise been deprived of their commanding officers through death or wounds, that the regiments of cavalry and infantry were, as he could see, greatly reduced in strength. They added that it was growing late, and that though the enemy were certainly retreating, they were doing so in good order, and showing an inclination to dispute every inch of ground tenaciously, whatever the havoc wrought in their ranks by our guns.
I think it's Digby Smith who said in his book about cavalry charges he noted that this was one of the greatest cavalry charges of the Napoleonic Wars that gets set off. That's the one. What is there to say exactly about this? What's it saying?
This account is obviously very personal because Caulaincourt is here describing the death of his brother. Caulaincourt has been critical of Napoleon throughout the campaign, and at the Battle of Borodino, when he describes being informed of his brother's death, and then saying, "I was at the Emperor's side. I need not attempt to describe my feelings." But one can have a pretty good guess.
Yeah. This is very much. This is him basically. What's the word, like enshrining his brother as a brave hero who died at the whim of a monster, kind of. But there's more. There's still some fighting to go.
So this account is by Ludwig August von Meerheim, who is a Saxon cavalry officer at the Battle of Borodino and fighting on the French side. The extract is read by Jacob Collier.
Hello everyone. My name is Jacob. I run the podcast on Germany. It's a podcast that goes through the entire history of the German people, starting from the very beginning and going till 2000. Right now, we are dealing with the first sack of Rome by the Goths. Should be very exciting. So if you'd like to learn more about the early Germans and about the Germans' relationship with the Romans, well, then I have quite a few amazing episodes for you. A side note, if any of you are doing Austrian or German history or related to Austrian or German history for graduate degrees, so if you're doing your thesis, your dissertation, or you're just trying to publish an article, please feel free to reach out to me at www.podcastongermany@gmail.com. We'd love to have you on the show this October. We already have quite a few interviews set up, but the more the merrier. Franz Ludwig August von Meerheim, Saxon cavalry officer, lieutenant colonel, 1813. The combat was frightful. Men and horses hit by gunshots collapsed into the ditches and thrashed around among the dead and dying, each trying to kill their enemy with their weapons, their bare hands, or even their teeth. To add to this horror, the succeeding ranks of assaulting cavalry trampled over the arriving masses as they drove on to their next targets, their infantry squares, who greeted them with well-aimed volleys. Whenever anyone opened the way, those who carelessly followed in their wake inexorably burst upon the steep height, on the edge of which the infantry was lying, calmly firing with their bayonets extended and receiving their assailants. For those aims to capture the redoubt, this struggle was repeated again in the depths of the ditch, filled with the dead. But the crown of the highest courage could only be attained by overcoming the breastwork, be it by climbing up, jumping over, or via pass through the rear of the fortification. Every moment was critical, and none were wasted. Despite all the perils and obstacles, we were unstoppable, and burst over and into the battery, inspired by the examples of our commanders, Generals Latour, Thielmand, and our brigade adjutant, von Minkwitz. The interior of the battery was an indescribable mess of infantry and cavalry, all intent on killing one another. The duration of the scene of murder was not to be measured in minutes, since the enemy, who outnumbered us by far, used all their means and even the now silenced pieces to avenge their inevitable deaths with their last breaths. Meanwhile, the battle raged terribly outside the hill, albeit only in a little more fluid manner. Masses and masses of the enemy threw themselves at the attackers, and no sooner had the first of them been smashed than the bayonets of fresh columns were already visible again. As little as the eye could wander elsewhere in such terrible moments, we could see so many of them that the enemies, who were often falling upon us in groups, were not isolated, but resembled an incoherent mass standing to be slaughtered in the background. Only the narrowness of the space prevented them from using their full might against us. It was therefore to be admired that our brave riders did not become completely discouraged when, as more and more of them combined together, they saw the terrible, increasingly violent, renewed struggle continue without any end. However, they probably did not notice the danger of their own situation, because with the same enthusiasm and perseverance, they continued their bloody business of murder inexorably, until the violence of fate snatched away what they had achieved with so much blood. At the most dangerous part of the heights and its immediate area, Thälmann's brigade was all alone. This Westphalian brigade had partly followed in support, but was not yet with us. Some of them, to the right, were also engaged in an important struggle, but I am unable to give any precise information about it. The infantry, which had previously been skirmishing, threw themselves to our left into the hollow, which wrapped around on the further side of the fieldwork to help us storm the position. Most of the infantrymen, however, had drawn a little closer during that time, but without taking any real part in the attack. Likewise, the closed French cuirassier column in the front had charged into the ravine. All the batteries, however, including our Saxon ones, the latter had united with the rest of the division as far as terrain and other circumstances allowed, frequently changing positions with us, now in front, now to the side, or on the ridges behind us. Had been positioned since the start on the high ground behind us. Also, more of them were opposite the enemy front. However, because of our presence, they could only direct their fire over our heads at the enemy masses in their rear. I had worked my way route out of the melee in and around the fieldwork, and was now on the high plateau that encompassed it. A brief orientation convinced me that the affairs of the winners were not the best here. The forces of the opposing Russians only seemed to have died under the Saxon sabers in order to rise and be replenished with double anger. Our strength began to wane, when finally, to our delight, a moment came when we were only dealing with the enemy in front of us, and were not opposed by fresh masses. But it was this observation that was so benevolent to us that signaled our ruin, because it served only to leave room for the still fresh enemy infantry which had been held back. We were still in a bloody hand-to-hand fight with the Russians, still standing fast among our horses, when the enemy cavalry fell upon us from several sides. Cuirassiers and dragoons, Chevalier guards and horse guards at full gallop, but closing upon us like walls, charging furiously against us. We were exhausted, and with a little effort, they caused a terrible bloodbath among us. Everyone was too shocked, probably too weakened, to be able to make a quick, immediate decision. Nobody even thought of the flight or did not want to consider it. So, a lot of victims fell before their last resort was finally employed. It was impossible for us to resist, because the enemy's charge was too violent to think of reforming up there. With the greatest regret, most of the victors, that is, the mass of riders who were fighting on the plateau, were forced after the desperate efforts to leave a point that had been so laboriously attained and covered with a myriad of bleeding companions. It was left to only a few troops, among them Captain Schnift von Pilasch and Adjutant von Mickwitz, to assert themselves up on the heights, baptized with Saxon victors' blood, until their compatriots could bring them salvation. In the wild confusion, the superior mass of riders came around and rushed down the edge of the hill, which now turned out to be even more of a rush for man and horse than when climbing up, while the enemy tried to follow us with a terrible roar. At last we saw something auspicious. A wall of armored hordes, French cuirassiers, in front of us on the far side of the ravine, and hoped for salvation and revenge. But their hope faded when this mighty colossus suddenly, as if in a panic of terror, turned right and rushed away in greater disorder than we did. Meanwhile, we had been in the ravine and were determined, relying on that support to put an end to the enemy's fierce charge, to avenge our sacrifice on them. But the escape of the French cuirassiers also deprived us of this prospect, and if only for a few moments, we were even worse off due to the enemy's furious pursuit. In great despair, us few that remained rushed up the other side of the ditch, under hot pursuit from the enemy, following the mass of cavalry fleeing in front of us. I should mention here that I worked my way through the disorderly masses with a truly desperate effort, sometimes through elegant words in an attempt to encourage the French vanity or military ambition, as others relentlessly resorted to more violent means, which the critical moment may excuse. True. And lo and behold, it did not take long for the efforts to be realized. For after we had about 150 paces behind us, the rolling colossus began to gather again and to organize itself, and finally stopped. The cavalry hurriedly returned to the heights to confront the pursuing enemy forces. The direction of the steeplechase drew us not to the side from which we came, but rather ran at a right angle to the battlefront, namely in a depression opposite the fortification. Although it was not broad, it was sufficient to accommodate us collectively. When we sought, the moment was favorable. It was able to fit the entire front of each regiment of our brigade, which, of course, had already taken terrible attrition, since around 3/4 of it were no longer present. They were either dead, wounded, or missing.
This one. This is going back to kind of Norov's kind of levels of, generally speaking, we're talking about what is within eye line, we're seeing here, and the enclosed spaces of the Raevsky Redoubt, and its environs. That is his work. That is the world of this officer at this particular moment, and it is a hellish thing from some sort of Goya.
Or Hieronymus Bosch.
Yes, indeed. The combat was frightful as it just starts out. It's just that way, and the way he talks about it in terms of murder and relentless death and just living to kill the next human being that sort of comes into your path is what is being described here. This is the taking of the Raevsky Redoubt by the French cavalry.
One interesting part that I want to mention is the way that he describes the Russian infantry, who just seem to, like zombies, just sort of they can't get killed, or they're just replaced by others like a hydra or something. He can only see what's in front of him, and he sees the endless walls of Russian lines, and realizing that he and many of his men are probably not going to survive the ordeal. This is where the Russians dig the grave of the French cavalry. And this is the subject of the next account, which is from Mikhail Barclay de Tolly, the commander-in-chief of the Russian First Western Army, and it is read by me. And I'm sure all of you know who I am.
By now.
An account of the military campaign of 1812
by Mikhail Barclay de Tolly, Commander-in-Chief of the Russian First Western Army at the Battle of Borodino. Then once again artillery from both sides opened their deadly fire. It seemed that Napoleon had decided to destroy us with artillery. With incredible firmness, our infantry endured the most terrible cannon fire. In particular, the troops at an angle from centre suffered great losses, because the fire from many enemy batteries intersected there. During this terrible cannonade, mowing down whole ranks on both sides, the enemy formed several cavalry and infantry columns. I envisaged a fierce attack from the enemy. My cavalry was already desperately fatigued. I immediately sent after the 1st Cuirassier Division, believing that it was still at the place I deployed it, from where I intended to preserve it for the decisive attack. But unfortunately, it was ordered away, I do not know by whom, to the left flank. My adjutant barely found 2 Cuirassier regiments, and, turning them back, sent them immediately to me. Meanwhile, the enemy already began his offensive. With part of his cavalry, he tied down ours, and with the other he cut into the 24th Division, was engaged in covering the battery on the central heights. The enemy overran it and facilitated his attacks with infantry columns, which were then approaching from the other side. The heights were taken by storm together with part of the artillery, and the 24th Division returned in the greatest confusion, but was immediately stopped and reformed. Then the enemy cavalry launched a coordinated attack against our infantry. I already anticipated that this was the moment that our fate would be decided. My cavalry was insufficient to detain this enemy horde, and I was unable to lead it against the enemy, suspecting that it would be overrun and pushed back against the infantry in disorder. I entrusted all my hope on the brave infantry and artillery, which proved themselves to be immortal on this day. They fulfilled my expectations, and the enemy was stopped. At this most difficult moment, 2 Guard Cuirassier regiments arrived. I pointed out the enemy, and with rare fearlessness, the regiments rushed to attack. The Sumsky, Mariupolsky, and Orenburg dragoons pursued them. The Pskov dragoons and the Izumsky hussars, also detached without my knowledge, then arrived under the command of General Korff. I placed them in reserve. Thus began one of the most stubborn cavalry battles ever fought. The enemy and our cavalry overran each other in turn, then they reformed under the protection of cavalry and infantry. Finally, ours succeeded with the assistance of the horse artillery and the infantry in turning the enemy cavalry to flight. They completely withdrew from the field of battle. The infantry opposite 4th Corps also retreated almost out of the view of artillery, leaving behind a chain of fire, but the captured heights was defended even more heavily. Behind it still stood several columns of infantry and a small number of cavalry. The artillery fire was renewed. The enemies weakened little by little, but our battery was constantly in action until the evening against the aforementioned heights and the columns deployed behind it. Finally, the darkness of night also established silence from our side.
I think it's really good here that we see, from Barclay's perspective, of course, I think it's really good here that we see him taking control of an aspect of the battle. He reads the situation. He's reading the situation well. The French cavalry have conquered their redoubt, but they're disordered, as all cavalry are when they have to occupy a position. In fact, they can't occupy a position. It's the rules. Cavalry cannot hold ground. They can only take it.
Right. Yeah.
And so what do you do to drive cavalry off? You throw cavalry at it. And it's really interesting the way he describes. I mean, it's really fortunate. His instinct is correct. He just doesn't have the material initially to do much about it. And then he finds men. 2 Guard Cuirassier regiments arrives, and he throws them in. And then more arrive. Obviously, a trickle of reinforcements begin to arrive. And actually, it works really well, because that means serried, fresh Russian regiments are all starting to pile in.
Continually being introduced into the fight.
One of the most stubborn cavalry battles ever fought, so he says.
Right.
And, it's very good language, very simple language of a guy who saw it. The enemy and our cavalry overran each other in turn. And that's just how cavalry battles work.
Yeah.
It's whoever has the best reserves wins a cavalry battle. That's it.
Yeah. The next extract is from The Cavalry Maiden by Nadezhda Durova. The extract is read by Lisa Kinch, who, as well as being the better half of Conrad Kinch, is also a professional actor, as you will hear.
The Cavalry Maiden. Nadezhda Durova, also known as Alexander Alexandrov or Alexander Sokolov, 1783 to 1866. Officer in the Lithuanian Ulan Regiment. The 26th. A hellish day. I have gone almost deaf from the savage, unceasing roar of both artilleries. Nobody paid any attention to the bullets which were whistling, whining, hissing, and showering down upon us like hail. Even those wounded by them did not hear them. We had other worries. To my great displeasure, our squadron went on the attack repeatedly. I have no gloves, and my hands are so numb from the cold wind that I can barely flex my fingers. When we are standing still, I return my sabre to its scabbard and bury my hands in the sleeves of my greatcoat. But when they order us to attack, I have to take out the sabre and hold it bare-handed in the wind and the cold. I have always been very sensitive to cold and bodily pain in general. Now, bearing the brutal north wind to which I am exposed without protection day and night, I can feel that my courage has diminished since the start of the campaign. There is no timidity in my soul. My face has never changed color. I am calm. But I would be overjoyed to see the end of the fighting. Oh, if only I could get warm and sense again that I have arms and legs. Now I cannot feel them. My wish has been granted. How is not important. At least it has been granted. I am not in battle. I have warmed up. I can feel my arms and legs, and my left leg in particular gives me very tangible proof that I still have it. It is swollen, blackened, and aches unbearably. I received a contusion from a cannonball. The sergeant major caught me before I could fall off my horse, supported me, and led me away from the lines. Despite the many battles I have been in, I had no concept at all of a contusion. I thought that receiving one did not count as being wounded, and therefore, when I saw no blood on my knees, I returned to my post. Podyampolsky glanced around, saw me standing ahead of our line, and asked in astonishment, "Why did you come back?" "I'm not wounded," I replied. The captain, assuming I had been hit by a spent bullet, was reassured, and we continued to hold our position under fire until nightfall. Then the enemy began lighting us up. Then the enemy began lighting us with incendiary balls which skipped picturesquely past our lines. At last even this sport ended, and everything quieted down. Our regiment moved back a little undismounted, but Podyampolsky's squadron remained on horseback. I no longer had the strength to hear the torment I was suffering from my aching leg, the cold that turned my blood to ice, and a cruel ache in my limbs. I think because I had not been off my horse even for a minute all day. I told Podyampolsky that I could no longer keep in the saddle, and that if he would permit it, I would go to the wagon trail, where Staff Dr. Kornilovich would see what was wrong with my leg. The captain agreed. At last the time has come when I went willingly to the wagons I had previously so scorned. I went without being seriously wounded. What can valour do against the cold? Leaving the squadron, I set out in the company of an Uhlan down the road to the wagon trail, barely suppressing groans of pain. I was unable to go any farther than Borodino, however, and stopped in this hamlet, which was packed from one end to the other with wounded. After searching in vain for a cottage which would take me in and meeting refusals everywhere, I decided to enter and take a place without asking consent. I opened the door of a large peasant cottage, as dark as the grave, and was greeted by 20 voices shouting painfully at me from the gloomy depths. "Who's there? What for? Shut the door! What do you want? Who's that? Who came in?" I replied that I was an Uhlan officer, wounded, and had not been able to find quarters, and I asked them to let me spend the night there. "Impossible, impossible," cried out several voices at once. "There's a wounded colonel, and we're cramped as it is." Well, then the wounded colonel should know from his own experience how hard it is to look for quarters in that condition. And no matter how cramped you are, you should offer to let me stay with you and not drive me out. To this sermon someone replied curtly, "Well, stay if you like. There's nowhere for you to lie down." "That's my concern," I said, overjoyed to find myself in warmth at last. I crawled onto the stove and lay down at the edge of it, not only wearing all my weapons, but without even removing my helmet. My hands began to thaw, and the pain to subside. But my contused leg was stiff as a board. I couldn't move it even slightly without pain. Worn out from cold, hunger, fatigue, and pain, I fell into a profound sleep in a minute.
Meaty topic for her. Good for an actor to have this one, I think. I'm sure she enjoyed this.
This extract is quite strange. It was published in 1836 after being encouraged by Alexander Pushkin. And one gets the sense that Pushkin encouraged her to publish this after she told him that she had left a diary. One gets the impression that this account was embellished to some extent to reflect the fact that she was a woman, and also to emphasize the idea of the Russian winter. So she describes suffering from the cold wind, despite the fact that actually at the Battle of Borodino it was a rather warm day. And I'm pretty sure that no one in the Russian army would have been wearing their greatcoat during the battle.
What I like about it, though, is the deafness that she mentions after the battle. I also like the fact that her sensibility about being what is a wound, and because it didn't break the skin, because it didn't actually touch her.
Yeah, she wasn't bleeding or anything.
Yeah.
She's just of the impression that, you know, it's not even a flesh wound.
Yeah.
Another interesting aspect is the way she describes how she tries to find some quarters. So the interesting thing she says about how, despite being wounded, she's unable to find any quarters, and only in the end takes her own initiative, and therefore it's extremely difficult for the wounded to actually seek decent shelter.
Well, a very common thing after all battles is the struggle for the wounded to try and survive.
The next extract is once again from Fyodor Glinka's essays on the Battle of Borodino, and it is read by the host of this channel, Josh Pro.
Essays on the Battle of Borodino. Fyodor Glinka, Adjutant to General Mikhail Miloradovich. Borodino, 52 days after the battle. Napoleon left Moscow. His troops, defeated at Maloyaroslavets, hurried to secure the Great Smolensk Road, and several columns reached it near Mozhaisk. Finally, they approached the field at Borodino, A sense of emptiness and sadness hung around the field, which was at once enlivened by a terrible, fiery existence, now dead and icy. The neighbouring villages were burned. The woods, denuded by autumn and by billeted troops, were thinned out. A leaden sky hung over the semi-bleached hills. And in this grave desolation, corpses were lying about and piled up in terrible heaps. It was a cemetery without graves. Thousands were scattered without burial. For 52 days they lay prey for the elements and temperature changes. Rarely was the form of a person preserved. They were not disturbed by worms and decomposition, due to the all-embracing winter. But there were other enemies. Herds of wolves fled from all the forests of Smolensk province. Birds of prey flocked from all the surrounding fields. And often forest predators fought with the avian ones for the right to torment the dead. Birds picked out the eyes, and the wolves gnawed at the bones. In one place, by the side of the Semyonovskoye redans, 20,000 bodies lay with a lustre resembling a paved road. Skeletons of horses with bare ribs, broken weapons, broken drums, helmets, bags, overturned wagons without wheels, wheels without axles, icy bloodstains frozen to the ground, multicolored rags of uniforms of different troops, different peoples. This was how the Borodino field was decorated. The Gorky and Tchevardino hills, and the large central redoubt, stood like desolate forts, terrible witnesses of terrible destruction. The twilight of evening presented a visual illusion, with the pale twinkling of the moon. It seemed that occasionally human images flickered on the tops of the abandoned batteries. There were definitely people, albeit dead and ossified, succumbed to the cold and pressed against the parapets by piles of dead. They, the dead, guarding the dead, stood straight and looked to the field with cloudy eyes. The wind caused the colourful fragments of clothes to ripple and gave them motionless the appearance of some momentary life through deceptive movements. But on this field of death and destruction there was one living person among the whole nation of the dead. Hundreds of unfortunate people like him, having been left behind on the banks of the Stonets, went to lament and die on the banks of the Sietin. This one remained loyal to the Borodino field. "Who are you?" the French asked, hearing their native tongue near the main road. "I am an unfortunate half-human, half-dead. 8 weeks ago I was wounded in the great battle. Canister tore away both my legs. When I came to myself, it was already night, and no one was on the field. I crawled along the banks of the stream, eating grass, roots, and breadcrumbs, which I found in the knapsacks of the dead. At night I climbed into the skeletons of horses, and applied their fresh meat to my fresh wounds. Having become accustomed to the acuteness of the Russian air, I grew stronger and felt some strength in myself. Blood was no longer flowing from my wounds, but I was alone. At night, it's true, the field livened up. Some sort of roaming lights wandered around it in different directions. These were the battalions of wolves, come to feed on the remains of our battalions. I struck at a flint with my bayonet, and at times I burnt a little gunpowder, and thereby drove away the enemies. And why did they pursue me? They have a rich dining table without my still warm bones. Alienated from the living world, from people with warm blood, from civilization, I finally looked closely at my motionless comrades. For them time no longer existed, while it still ticked above me. At the beginning of each day I placed a soldier's bayonet in a conspicuous place, and there are already 50 from the time since I have been here alone. If I had been frightened by the wolves at night, then during the day I was glad of the presence of dogs, several of which bestowed upon me their caresses, as if they recognized me as the master of Borodino Field. These packs of dogs ran up from nearby villages, but no people were seen anywhere. Sometimes in the silence of the long, endless Russian nights, it seemed that a battle was raging somewhere, with intermittent gunfire. Some sounds are unclear, distant. Some voices are fleeting. A dull rumble from Russia, of the nations of Europe. The authorities took care to clear away Russian fields of corpses, which, without doubt, would have increased infections if they had been left until the warm spring days. And then one night, on one long, frosty night, the sky over the frozen field of Borodino turned into a red glow. Residents of Lwovo, Bratovo, Bezyobovo, Ryachchevo, Yelnya, and Borodino itself, forewarned by the summons from the local court, crawled out of their straw dugouts and, with long poles, axes and pitchforks, went to the Borodino field, where peasants from neighbouring fields were already working. Long rows of bonfires made of dry brushwood and tarry wood cracked on the banks of the Stonyets, Ognik, and Koloch. People with blackened faces from soot in dirty rags, carrying huge hooks, indiscriminately dropped the bodies of those killed on these huge bonfires. As these bodies burned, clouds of fat, whitish smoke hung over the Borodino field. On these bonfires burned the bones of the native sons of happy lands, Languedoc, Provence, the bones of the descendants of ancient French kings, princes of old, new counts and generals of the new French Empire, the descendants of ancient lords, powerful German barons, the bones of French grenadiers, voltigeurs, and musketeers, and Napoleon's men of iron. There burned the bones of armed hordes of 12 invading nations. There burned the bones of men whose return to their native lands, to the fragrant groves of Italy, to the flowering valleys of Andalusia, was so eagerly awaited by their fathers and mothers in magnificent castles, and their brides at the wedding altar. Long-standing titles, distinctions, nobility, all were burned, and was there really no creature who would shed a loving tear on those bones of enemies and fellow countrymen? But there, under the glow of an unprecedented fire, amidst the blazing bonfires, two people appear on the field of Borodino. One was a woman, slender and tall. The other was a hermit, dressed as a monk. Both were in black funerary clothes. Her cross glistens on her chest, full of symbols of death, images of the skull and bones of Adam. Between the blazing fires, along the banks of the silent Ognik stream, they go, in silence, at night, under a storm. She carries a reservoir of tears. He carries a vial of holy water and a dispenser. While the woman cries and prays, the humble hermit prays and sprinkles the water of life on the living dead, and those dead without life. And those tears, whose blessings under the cloak of a black autumn night, under a storm of blowing bonfires, are being administered by those descendants of the ancient knights, whose generals and dukes, whose giants of our time, who are to embark on a long and unknown journey. They, by some incomprehensible force, charmed under the influence of the all-powerful will of a sorcerer, came with their troops, with their columns, to lay their bones on Russian soil, and to deliver those bones to feed Russian fires, and to deliver the ashes of those bones to the scattering to the winds of the Moscow region. Among the performers of these public duties, both a hermit, a clergyman from the neighbouring monastery, and the woman, the widow of General Tuchkov, were the only representatives of love, the highest form of Christian love. On the central region of the Semyonovskoye batteries, Margarita Tuchkova, giving up all her rights, of which there were many, and claims to worldly happiness, having removed the bright clothes of the laity and put on a black nun's habit, built a church to Christ the Saviour, and set up a community in which humble nuns live and pray. Under the dome of this church, on the left side, there is a monument to Alexander Tuchkov, in which the icon of the Mother of God is preserved. He carried this icon in all his campaigns before the Battle of Borodino, and in all the campaigns his wife accompanied him, faithful to death, and inseparable from him in death. The bones of princes and dukes, and the remnants of squadrons, and fragments of weapons, all burned together from dusk till morning. And the sunlight fell on the Borodino field, which turned grey from the ashes of human bones. Winter passed. The warm spring rains watered the surroundings of Mezhaisk, and grass and vegetation grew high in places of great massacre. The villagers said amongst themselves, "Our land has become plentiful," and the local police officials, checking the reports of the village police, village headmen, and district clerks, announced the gross result. December 3rd, the year 1812. Total of all human and horse corpses burned on the Borodino field, 93,999.
You don't need to say much more than that.
You don't need to say much more than that. And so, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our special episode, Voices from Borodino. And, I personally would like to thank everybody for joining in, and I want to thank everybody who watched.
And we hope you enjoyed watching the video and you learnt something more about the Battle of Borodino.
Indeed. And so we'll, in memory of the Battle of Borodino, thank you for watching. We will see you again next time.